Welcome back to Community of Poets. I'm Anthony Sovak, and today I'm here with Reed Dickson, who is an educator, writer, and musician who teaches part-time for Pima Community College and facilitates community workshops in creative writing. His poems have appeared in Matter Monthly, as well as the recent published anthology, Resist Much, Obey Little. Reed was also the recipient of an Arizona Commission on the Arts grant and multiple grants from the Vermont Studio Center. Reed recently presented at the Modern Language Association and the National Council for Teachers of English on topics related to creative writing studies and craft criticism. He completed his MFA through Antioch University. Welcome, Reed.
Thanks, it's good to be here.
So I like to start off with questions from students in online creative writing poetry courses here at Pima Community College. And this one was addressed specifically to you, so I suspect it may have been from one of your students, but they're interested in how your love of poetry may or does or should or will cross over to music.
Sure. So I think my love for poetry and music are kind of inseparable. I came into poetry through music. I hated reading and writing in junior high and high school, but I always loved music and I always had a place for music. And I think it was reading the album covers of albums from the public library that drew me into writing and reading, for one thing. And so I think, you know, I might read a little short passage of something that reflects that. It's a prose poem that I started to write, and I'll just read a couple paragraphs of it that I think speak to this question. This is called An Ode to Singing When No One Can Hear You. In a box in the garage, I find myself singing. It was 20 years ago, and on both sides I am taking the songs of my familiar, which was Simon and Garfunkel, slowing the parts down or speeding them up into yearning crescendos. I was so damn talented, so impassioned, so made of my reaching. Remember those days, what happened to those days? I knew every word, and not just how they sung, but the way they tasted in my mouth. And in the recording, which I still recall making, it was simply me sitting on a tile floor, no one around. It was a school holiday when I was in the Peace Corps, where all the students had left their hostels and all the other teachers had gone into town, and it was just me with myself. What better thing was there to do than tune my guitar to its lowest string and tune myself into my old sense of song? I remember the red record button on my handheld tape recorder, flipping out double A's and putting in fresh ones. I remember unfolding this paper accordion of liner notes and slowly reading aloud all that surely I already knew by heart, every curve, every cushion of consonants, and that leaping out into silvery song. In other words, music is what brought me to poetry. And for me, music is poetry, whether it's good poetry or bad, it's all poetry.
Do you, I like how I remember these very specific things in that red button on the cassette recorder. I think everyone of a certain generation remembers that.
That's right.
Do you remember sticking a pencil through a tape?
I
And
do,
fixing
all the time.
But you also say, singing when no one's looking, and I think that this kind of speaks to our next question, which is, do you ever feel as if you couldn't share your writings or feel as if you had to write a certain way to make someone other than yourself happy? A teacher, a friend, a relative, a sort of self-censorship question, or not even just a self-censorship question, but also the putting yourself out there. How do you put yourself out there?
Yeah. I think absolutely. I think there's a lot of writing that we do that doesn't need to consider an audience. Just to get words on the page, sometimes we have to let the words flow. Just like I might if I'm sitting at the piano. I might get into a good rhythm and like the sound of something that I'm playing, and then let myself sing whatever comes. And writing is for me the same way. But if there's somebody else around me, I sometimes freeze up. That said, I get to the point where I start to envision someone else reading it that I want to read this, just like you would a letter. And as I revise, that's the point in which I start thinking about audience. But there are some poems that I've written that are simply, I think, for myself, that I don't want to publish, but I need to experience as a writer. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I know that when I was writing or as I'm writing my novel, I don't share that with everyone. Sometimes feedback can stifle us. Sometimes feedback can lift us. So we have specific readers we seek out that we know are going to give us the feedback we need to stay with it. But I don't think we should feel any obligation to always be concerned. Your question, I'm kind of digressing a little bit. Your question was, do we ever get pushed to, get anxious about who we're
Yeah, and I'm specifically thinking here, with our students in our especially online poetry classes, I mean, it's one thing to say, well, you don't need to share. I mean, you could be Emily Dickinson, put all your poems in a sock drawer and never share them with anyone. But on the other hand, you're in an online poetry workship. So, the whole idea is that you are, generating content and you are sharing it. And I feel like, I listen to my students read their poems and they're all very brave for doing so.
Absolutely.
And some of the bravest tell us about how they're afraid to,
Right.
and they vocalize that fear that, even I, and I'm sure every other poet feels when they're, getting onto a stage in front of a room full of people.
So I did a poetry writing workshop last night at Apollo Middle School with parents of kindergarten through fifth graders. And these are not poets necessarily. I would argue that we're all poets to a degree, because poet is that reaching with language to communicate the things of the heart. But in one of my surveys, the feedback, I was really pleased to see one student said that what was important that she learned is about having no omission and writing all that we desire about on that piece of paper. It's really difficult to be uninhibited. And I'm trying to record a bunch of video prompts now for our students to help them loosen up and just let the words flow. Because the goal of this writing, especially when we're getting started, is generative, to get words on the page. We can revisit them later and see how we want to revise them, but we just have to let the words flow. I should also say, in terms of the content, when I was in Vermont, at Vermont Studio Center, one of the visiting poets, when I was a young poet named Stanley Plumley, had a number of young men gathered around his table in the cafeteria. And he said to them, and I was there, he said, no offense to these other folks, but if you want to be political, write an essay. And that put a bad taste in my mouth, because I was writing about the Iraq War, I was writing about standardized testing, I was writing about all these issues that I felt like were personal to me. And sometimes for some of us, the personal is political. Do we omit that from our writing because the audience doesn't want it? We know from anthologies like these that there is a space for writing that engages in our current moment. I'll read an example from here, which is a poem that is probably similar to the style of my novel. The narrator's voice in my novel is super rhymey, but I trust it. That's the way it came out. And part of me wants to censor that, but part of me wants to just go with that flow, right? You get into the zone. So this is a poem called What Just Happened, and it has a strange visual shape. If you can see this, I wanted to play with the visual shape on the page because we can. I normally don't, but with this poem in particular, I really wanted to stretch the language visually. So this is called What Just Happened. In the left margin it says, the one thing I came here to say was, I don't know. It's been a long day. And then the language that wraps around it says, it's like imagining the square root of -1 and giving it a name. It's like it's a game, like shame, like blame and flames, like tortured and maimed. Toss up any word and all roads lead back to how I can't quite say what a despot is. It's all an abstraction. The great American fill in the blank, embarrassment, reality check, wake-up call, rallying call, time to stop coasting, time for action, for sense of urgency, even in poetry. Yes, especially there. The one thing I came here to say was, I don't know, it's been a long day. So there's the poem. I just let it happen. And I don't think it's necessarily easy to know who our audience is or what we need to say. But when I'm sitting at the piano, the same feeling happens. I trust it when it sounds good to my ears,
Yeah, so I think, sometimes we all have that inner hater in our head, right? That tells us, we're not good enough and we shouldn't even try, right? And I think that, in quoting from my dissertation from the rest of my life, Robert Frost, he's talked about this some, that you have to have that faith, that you're going to work through it, but it's really a belief in yourself,
Absolutely.
right? But to sort of address just one more of these fears from our students in that internal hater that will hate. I have an unrealistic fear, and I like how the student knows that it's an unrealistic fear. of unknowingly plagiarizing another poet's work. Do you have the same fear? If so, how do you navigate that or overcome it?
I think it's inevitable. A lot of our stories are accumulations of other people's stories. A lot of our joy and our love is an echo of things that we don't necessarily remember hearing. When I do notice it happening, I begin to, and I try to claim it overtly. I brought along one poem, which I could read, which is kind of, I realized that it was more E.E. Cummings' voice than my voice. We think about, well, what is the writer's voice? But as I explore my own writing, I enjoy, just like when I'm singing, when I started singing, I sang like James Taylor. Then I shifted a little bit. I could pull off an Eddie Vedder kind of sound. Then I shifted more to wanting to be more like Bruce Springsteen. And I threw all these voices together. And when I sit at the piano, I'm playing Nina Simone kinds of song, which whatever the energy is, I just fall into it. But sometimes I hear what makes my voice distinct in the midst of all that. And I trust it, but I still try to acknowledge the connection between what I hear. So this is after E.E. Cummings, a short piece called Somehow Amidst the Lush Bursting Middle Dark Thick Curls of Every Last Thing. And takes over, becomes the refrain, declares itself king, and proclaims itself so. And before, and after. The alpha and omega of dear everything, and in between, yes, the bountiful blue, green, purple, brown, dandelion, blood red rose world, and all that we taste, touch, smell, love, behold, yes, and become, all that we dwell upon and can dwell within, yes. Amidst all this, all smushes the all of between into an absence, a daydream to most likely forget, and at times there's so unmuch and no between, and, the day and night become mere punctuation. And brackets, you persist, my love. Between brackets, all arid ands, despite the brackets unrain. And if deep in the winter of your belief there is always, yes, spring, if day upon days is but mere dormancy, as though you always have sensed how between every brackets and a dry desert air bespeaks of strong brackets rain. Perhaps you already sense how in between ands, brackets, day bespeaks the unbrackets of yes, tomorrow. Is that me? Yeah, of course it's me, but it sounds different. And as I write this, I fall into it. I enjoy the language. It's different than other things that I write. Am I allowed to go there? Should I trust the impulse? I would say just like when you're making music, we go there, we play with sound, we enjoy ourselves. And if we get too caught up with identity of who we are, we forget that every poet goes through phases in their lives and their poetry changes over time, and we should just trust the experience.
Yeah, you don't want to silence your own voice for fear of stifling out the voices that inspired you to sing in the first place.
There we go.
Right?
I like that.
So I'm afraid we're almost out of time, Reed. Thanks. I regret that we don't have time to hear you sing like Eddie Vedder because I want to hear that.
Sure.
But anyway, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.